Today, the whole world is talking about war. All hearts are burdened, all lives are saddened by thoughts of this greatest of crimes against humanity. Everywhere you will hear people say we are back in the days of 1914. But the great masses of people of all nations who experience the misery of war will never again be war-minded in the 1914 way. Nobody is under any illusions about the glory of war today.
Australians, like others, believed that the First World War was the end of all war. But just 21 years later, the shadow of global conflict again darkened our lives. Once again, Australians crossed the world to do battle. Once again, they fought and died for a cause they believed in. But what began as a battle for the empire became a struggle for our own survival, a coming of age, and a test of the national character. This time, though, their Anzac fathers had told them what to expect.
He was a gentle person and a very loving father. So he didn't want me to go through what he went through, and he said, "You're a bloody fool." I said, "Dad, I've got to go, you know, got to go and help the empire."
In the 1930s, no young Australian could ignore the aftershocks of the Great War. Reminders of sacrifice had a hallowed place in households in every street.
I had a number of uncles and close people who came back and talked about it. And they told, you know, the nitty-gritty of machine guns and the mud and all the rest of it. So I had a pretty clear picture that it wasn't all nice.
The men who would go to the next war grew up with stories from the last one.
One of the chaps that worked for us on the station, he was a returned bloke from the First World War. He always said to me, "Dean, if there's ever another war, never join the bloody infantry," he said. And what did I do? I joined the infantry.
The next generation of soldiers had their values and characters shaped by the Great Depression of the 1930s. Like Australians before them, they learned the value of resilience and initiative.
My recollection of youth is of social relationships, of everyone getting along together and no one having very much. We could do a lot with very little. We made our own pleasures, and we didn't expect these other things. We weren't particularly discontented.
Through the depression and hardship, Australians clung to a belief in a lasting peace. So defence had been allowed to run down. a vast land with just 7 million people could not defend itself. Like our Navy and Army, the Air Force was primitive. Its newest fighter aircraft was already obsolete. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan rearmed. War was clearly possible. Japan's expansion had our leaders deeply worried. But in September 1939, it was Germany's military aggression that pulled Australia into war.
It is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war. No harder task can fall to the lot of a democratic...
I was out visiting some friends in the country, sitting in front of a nice big fire, and the owner of the property, he was an ex-serviceman. I can't remember how many others of us. And we just looked at one another and said, okay, we must do something. Let's join up.
Australians committed themselves to the defence of the Empire against Nazi Germany. It was 38 years since Federation, yet there was still no real conflict between being British and being Australian. It wasn't seen as someone else's war.
It was good, really, that way. Your loyalties, Australia didn't really matter that much. It was the loyalty to England was the thing.
Australians could not be compelled to fight overseas. So volunteers were called for the 2nd AIF, successors to the Anzacs. But slow enlistment brought on propaganda.
We're going to give him the Razzie, 'cause he's a nasty Nazi. It's up to you and me.
And I didn't really, to be perfectly honest, consider I was making a great sacrifice. I was just doing the normal thing, if you like to say doing the duty, but it never occurred to anybody round about me that it wasn't the thing to do.
And they came around and said, who wants to join the AIF? And I was half asleep. I said, oh, yeah, I'll be in that. What is it? So from there on, I was sunk.
Once again, thousands of Australians volunteered for service half a world away. Yet again, our forces were placed at Britain's disposal. The RAAF's 10 Squadron, already training in Britain, went straight into action against the Germans. The Royal Australian Navy was immediately placed under Royal Naval Command. 5 destroyers and a cruiser joined the British fleet in the Mediterranean. Aboard HMAS Perth, the new recruits were settling in.
They were really children. They were only 18, 19, and with very young faces now. Almost everyone in that picture was killed later on.
The government wanted 20,000 Army volunteers. It took 3 months to get the numbers. Some just needed a job. Most thought the war was morally right, and all saw the chance of adventure. From these men came a new generation of that unique character, the Australian soldier. Men like Dick Tanner, who was sent to Paul Cullen's company.
And he came up to me, he was about 6'3", He was a drover. And he said, "You my new boss?" I said, "That's right." He said, "Can you lend me £1?" I said, "What do you want for?" He said, "Well, a lot of the fellas, or you'd have said a lot of the blokes, are going AWL. I don't know what it is, but I want to go with them. I need £1." I said, "Here's the £1." Well, you couldn't get a more dinky-die Australian than Sapper Tanner, the drover from Wallabadar. Australians from all walks of life were translated into first-class soldiers.
We had to join, we had to join, we had to join, we had to join, we had to join Bob Menzies' army. £2 a week, fuck all the eat, big leather boots and ballistas on your feet. We had to join, we had to join, we had to
I was only 16 then, but I did watch that with my mother. She used to take me into Sydney to do that. I think it affected her probably more than I, because she realised what war was. Having lost a brother in the First World War, she thought, oh, here we go again.
4 months after the declaration of war, the troops embarked. It was the first of many such convoys. And as each one left, the hard reality suddenly became clearer.
There were women on the other side of Sydney Cove, standing there dumbly in the drifts of rain, clinging to the wet iron and staring through the railings with hungry intentness. They made no effort to wave. Their faces, white and strained and tiny in the distance, hardly moved. All through the morning I noticed them and was aware of their tiny hands gripping the iron, and the rain over their knuckles, and running over their wedding rings.
I never left Sydney. Hadn't been outside of the metropolitan area of Sydney until I joined the army.
As they had in 1914, young Australians willingly crossed the world to another war. Most went to the Middle East to protect Empire interests. Their desert training began in Palestine. Like their fathers before them, they were raw and spirited and had to be transformed into professional soldiers.
But you've got to be healthy. You've got to be courageous. And that means a tinge of recklessness. That's the infantry have got a fixed bandits in charge, recklessly, often to their death.
Changing these civilians into soldiers would take a lot of time. Time that would create powerful bonds. The mateship, that in the end mattered more than anything else.
The friendships you forged, and we could talk to one another so openly. It was amazing, really. It bonded such a friendship. It was unbelievable. We were more than brothers. That was the point of it all.
As the Australians trained, the Empire was facing disaster. France fell and Dunkirk was evacuated. Italy joined the war on the side of Germany, and London was pounded from the sky. "30 Australian pilots fought in the Battle of Britain. And in the Mediterranean, HMAS Sydney played a major role in sinking the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni. Back home, the Sydney's crew were greeted as heroes. The mood in Australia changed, with unprecedented numbers enlisting. Then in January 1941, the untried young men of the 2nd AIF finally entered into battle. The Italians planned to dominate northern Africa and were threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal. The new Anzacs confronted them in Libya, a country many of the Australians had never known existed. They went to war near a town called Bardia.
We got issued with an issue of rum, a little nip. I mean, it wouldn't even curdle your hair sort of thing, and away you went. And you're too busy looking for this and that to worry about yourself.
You take for granted there'll be casualties, and you just hope secretly that it won't be yourself.
The Italians thought we had armoured plating on, and because they were firing at us and none of us were going over. I don't think they had the determination in them, because it was only a desert, and who wants the darn desert? I mean, they couldn't see any point in that.
Though greatly outnumbered, the Empire forces captured Bardia within 2 days. 40,000 Italian prisoners were taken. The men of Bardia proved that they were worthy successors to the Anzacs, with the same self-mocking spirit.
One of my very best friends, Geoffrey Cox, was a lieutenant then, and during the attack on Bardia, a bullet pierced the cheeks of his bottom. So as he was hobbling out, someone said, "You're a lucky fellow, you got 5 arseholes."
The Italians were driven back across Libya in a series of hard-fought battles. Tobruk, Derna, and Benghazi were taken. Morale soared with each victory.
Darling, I hope you were not among the mob that raided Bardia the other day. I have worried since, as we were told 60 failed to return. Every minute of every day and night, you are in my mind. One says, thank God as each day passes, for each day gone is one nearer to your return, for which I pray day and night.
Australian women were again learning to live without their men. But many women now had opportunities previously denied them. The resources of the country were diverted to the war effort. Even so, other aspects of life went on much as before.
Going to work every day, working in a theatre, with your usherette, you monitor the sound and you take people to their seats and all that. Going out at night time, dancing and all that. I was sort of a very happy person and I didn't think a lot about the war.
And today, 12,000 miles from London, 10,000 miles from Washington, and but 3,000 miles from Tokyo, many Australians fear that 1941 has been chosen by militarist Japan as its year of opportunity.
There was a fear of Japan. We felt that the yellow hordes would overrun us eventually. There was always that fear. We didn't have a lot of Asians here. There were very few Chinese in Little Bourke Street, a few Chinese up at Ballarat, but we didn't mix with them. So we didn't really know very much about the outside world. We were a community of ourselves, and we loved being Australians. We knew we were part of the British Empire, so we knew that if anything happened, the British Empire would come to our rescue, and we felt that.
Australians had always assumed that the British presence in Singapore would protect them. But by 1940, British eyes were firmly fixed on Hitler. The Australian government agreed to send a contingent of troops to Singapore to bolster the British garrison.
When we landed in Singapore and there was nothing doing there, we thought, well, what do we send you here? We're on a holiday. Some of the commentators in the press, they didn't call us glamour boys, but they used to be very caustic about the troops in Malaya, the wonderful time they were having while their brothers were fighting in the Middle East.
The remoteness of Australia allowed life to continue as ever. But that distance had its disadvantages. We were playing a minor role in determining where our troops would fight. The war was being run from Britain. So in 1941, our Prime Minister journeyed to London.
I want to tell them on behalf of Australia, and I believe I can say it, as a self-appointed ambassador for every British Dominion, that they are not alone against the world.
Churchill told Menzies our troops were now needed to fight the Germans in Greece. Menzies agreed, but he was not told by the British that Blamey, our senior general, had strong misgivings. The Australians were sent on what their own commander knew was a lost cause. Along with the troops went a contingent of Australian nurses.
So we sailed to the tune of Gracie Fields singing Wish Me Luck as you wave me goodbye. The whole convoy sailed off to Greece.
When we were going ashore in Port Pireus, the English sailors said to us, "We'll be back in 6 weeks to pick you up." That's how confident they were. That's how much they knew over us. We didn't know a darn thing.
Greece was the Empire's last surviving ally on the continent. Churchill had promised to defend the Greeks against Nazi aggression. It was a noble cause, but a catastrophic misjudgment. Australian, New Zealand and British soldiers were sent in to face an overwhelming German force. A brutal onslaught of over 200,000 troops.
The big difference between them and us was the fact that they had equipment. They had all the support in the world. Whereas we had our pea shooters, because it's a bit hard to fight tanks and Stuka dive bombers with pea shooters.
It was a sight to see on the opposite bank, the German regiment. There they were, in extended line after line after line, walking down to that ford, wading in, mown down, but gradually, as you do in war, they gained a position.
We could hear the guns at night, and the Germans flew so low over the trees that we could see them as they were flying over, because they had to go past us to go around to get to the airstrip, and blew up any planes that were there, so we had no air force.
In the air, the Germans were devastating, leaving the men on the ground defenseless. Just 8 days after the first German attack, the order came to withdraw.
We whinged and cried and, blew hell out of the English government for it, and we blamed the Germans for it. We blamed everybody but ourselves. But we never chucked the towel in. That's the main thing. You never say die.
One lass said, well, if you're taken a prisoner of war, she said, let your hair down. Make yourself look as ugly as you can, and any of you girls with dentures, take them out. Make yourselves as plain and ugly as you can.
It was just a defeat, which we knew we were defeated by overwhelming odds, and we did pretty well as an army against the Germans, but with no chance.
When the full story of these 2 or 3 weeks is written, the courage and endurance of the men who fought the rearguard action will amaze everyone. They fought by day and withdrew by night. For days they had little or no sleep. They were either fighting or moving all the time. Practically everyone had a bandage somewhere. Every one of them had a smile. Not even the Germans could remove that.
With the Allied fleet steaming to the rescue, the exhausted troops continued their fighting withdrawal to the beaches. Churchill's Greek campaign was a debacle.
We just sat on the beach until the early hours of the morning, and the next thing we knew, there was an English naval officer. He did say his name. I'm so-and-so, and I am in charge. It's a funny thing how his voice sounded. It just straightened us all up. It was, thank God someone's in charge, sort of thing.
As the troops came aboard, the Allied ships endured constant German bombings. In the thick of it all was HMAS Perth.
They had scrambling nets down over the side. And they were in a bad way, a lot of them. And their attitude was just they were glad to be alive. And they were glad we were there.
It was all dark excepting for burning ships in the harbour. And we had to get over the rails and whatever they had, carrying what you had, what you could have salvaged. And I heard a voice say, "Give me your hand, mate." And I said, "Oh, I'm all right, thank you." And they didn't know, these men didn't know they were getting women. They had no idea. He said, "Struth, be women." They were really taken back. But they were marvellous boys. They rescued us and talked and talked and talked all night. They were just so happy to find somebody speaking the same language. Australians to talk to, Australian women. It was wonderful. There was a real camaraderie there, I can tell you.
The Germans' relentless advance continued into Crete, where many of the Australian troops had been evacuated. Ill-equipped and exhausted, they went back into battle. They fought doggedly, but were overwhelmed in under a fortnight. One division was now crippled, and 5,000 Australians had been taken prisoner. Later, the Perth returned to Sydney for repairs. and found a complacent and unaware country.
We'd just come back from seeing all this bombing. You know, in Greece, we were in Piraeus and we saw them bombed out, civilians and everything. And we saw the whole real business. We got back to Australia and I could get night leave, you see, and go out. So we had to be back on board at 8 o'clock in the morning and hop in the tram coming back. And here were all the civilians. They'd open their papers and read it. Quick glance at the headlines, right over to the back page to study the racing. Didn't have a clue. And it was then we used to say, well, you know, there should be a bombing of Sydney to wake these blokes up.
Early in 1941, Hitler determined to rescue the Italians in North Africa. He sent General Rommel and his celebrated Afrika Korps into Libya. Confronting them were fresh Australian troops.
The first few Germans that I struck, they were pretty tough and they were good fighters. I was surprised how young they were. I know I was young. I mean, I don't suppose I thought about that, but they didn't seem much more than boys, you know.
These Australians would now have their first experience of combat. They had limited training and equipment, and the Germans pushed them and the Empire troops back to the port of Tobruk.
I had the idea that there was going to be risk, but the risk was offset by the excitement and enjoyment and the masculine maleness of the thing. I'd never seen a dead person before I was in the army, and pretty hard actually for a start, but I've told a lot of people that my way of dealing with it was just to turn your brain off. Just turn your brain off when you're in those battles and people are getting shot and blown up and killed, and other people are, you know, breaking down and all this sort of thing that goes in action.
They fought with their backs to the sea and were told there'd be no surrender or retreat. Tobruk had to be held to stall the German advance on Egypt. Cut off by land, Tobruk could only be supplied from the sea. 9 aging Australian warships, known as the Scrap Iron Flotilla, became an inspiring lifeline. 2 ships were lost as they repeatedly ran the gauntlet of German bombs.
In the front line, of course, you didn't get practically no sleep because you got shelled and mortared every day and all day. You went weeks and weeks without a bath, weeks and weeks without changing your clothes. If you slept at all, you'd probably sleep in the daytime, and because there was millions of flies and millions of fleas in those trenches.
The Germans were used to swift victories. But time and again, their attacks on the impudent Australians were repulsed. They derisively called them the Rats of Tobruk. It was adopted as a badge of honour.
The Germans were good fighters. They were rather like Australians, I suppose. We respected them, and I think they respected us, although they called us rats. No, I don't think we hated them. Yet we shot them up. It's strange, isn't it? I used to say, there's no comedians and there's no atheists in the front line.
On the front line, the Rats would sleep by day and harass the enemy at night. For months on end, they lived in holes in the ground, on the edge of survival and breakdown.
Oh, they'd be like people with dementia. They're just wandering around like lost and talking to themselves, and you know, just complete nervous breakdown. The important thing for every man when he's in a situation like that is that he doesn't let go, because he can't be looked upon by his mates as being a coward, so he has to pretend to be completely nonchalant about what's happening. People blown to bits. You know, of course, people get shot. They only need to get one bullet and they're dead. You know, they might stagger around a bit for a while, but usually they just drop like a stone. And often, you know, people that you've become very friendly with. Yeah. And it all makes you pretty aggressive. We had a couple of suicides. They were a pity, because they were too distraught. But less said about those the better, I suppose.
Left ranging. 8-400. Fire.
For 6 months, the largely Australian force held out against an enemy twice its size. And for the first time, a determined German offensive was turned back. It was a shining moment for the Empire in the darkest days of the war. And the siege of Tobruk entered Australian folklore.
You poor fools. The world will know you as the rats of Tobruk. You ignominious sons of sheep-herders. You are just a mere handful, do you hear me? Just a mere handful. You're not enough.
Not enough. We are enough. We are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men the greater share of honor. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand at tiptoe when his day is named. We few. We happy few. We band of brothers.
As the rats of Tobruk frustrated the Germans, Australians were also fighting in Syria and Lebanon. With Empire forces, they defeated the pro-Nazi Vichy French. The Australians did most of the fighting and sustained most of the casualties. Crucial to their success was support from the air. Day after day, RAAF Tomahawk fighters took to the skies, harassing the enemy and protecting Allied troops. Their perilous desert war would continue for more than 2 years.
Combat's a funny thing. There's not very much difference between cowardice and bravery. And, you know, I think I wavered between the two, I suppose. And because underneath I was a coward, but sometimes in combat you forgot how cowardly you were and you got stuck in.
The freewheeling Australian airmen had been supporting our troops since the first battles with the Italians. They built an impressive record, constantly outperforming the enemy. But regular losses of men and aircraft were inevitable.
When you'd land back, you'd wait and count the aeroplanes that came back to see who was missing. And someone probably come back 10 minutes later and you'd be probably given him up for dead, and there'd be a great feeling of relief when he'd land in. In our mess, we never had special seats for anyone, because if someone was missing, there wasn't a vacant place, because we used to move around in the mess.
By August 1941, the surviving Australians in Tobruk were in a desperate state. Six months of fighting had left them dangerously weakened.
Everybody in Tobruk, especially the frontline soldiers, they all suffered from malnutrition eventually. And we only used to get a pint of water a day, and sometimes you didn't get that. I used to dream of a tap running. The idea of being able to turn a tap on and see water gush out, it was a fantasy.
This could not continue. The Australians had already sustained almost 4,000 casualties at Tobruk. Blamey, the Australian commander, asserted his independence. Against the wishes of the British, he demanded his troops be relieved. After the losses in Greece and Crete, the AIF needed to regroup. Battered but unbeaten, the now legendary Rats of Tobruk were withdrawn. But their achievements were soon overtaken by events back home. We had a new Prime Minister who took control during the gravest crisis in our history.
I put it to you as shortly as I can. Labor stands for Australia. Australia stands for and with the Empire. The Empire stands and fights for freedom and for liberty wherever liberty and freedom are in danger.
The threat was now coming dangerously close to home. Most of the sailors who'd been cheered as the heroes of the Mediterranean now became the victims of a German raider off Western Australia. HMAS Sydney was sunk with the loss of all on board, 645 men. Australians were shocked.
Perhaps we, like on board, didn't take it quite as seriously because we'd seen so many ships sunk and that, well, this is just another ship. But of course it was the end of the world for a lot of people in Australia. How dare they sink an Australian ship, you know, and what terrible things. It's not like most people, you know, no tragedy's a tragedy till it affects them.
Australia was now exposed. Just how vulnerable we were became clear on the 7th of December 1941, when Japan entered the war.
To the women of Australia in this terrible emergency, in humble duty we say, be steadfast, and all will be well. Young in history, unblooded on our own soil, let us give to the world a saga from the south that the world will hear and marvel upon. To the heathen hordes who seek to dye the Pacific with blood, let us run our star-strewn flag to the masthead.
Oh, one Australian was worth 10 Japanese. We could handle 10 Japanese, no problem at all.
Well, we were told that the Japanese soldier was short-sighted. They had rifles, and this is a fact, that they had rifles that fired small bullets, and if you got a small bullet in, you could pull it out.
They didn't fight at night time. And little bow-legged blokes, we found it entirely different.
Our belief in the inferiority of the Japanese soldier was only exceeded by our faith in the British to protect us. In the coming weeks, both beliefs would be severely challenged. The defence of Australia had long depended on a British promise to protect the region with a major naval presence in Singapore. While the British were in Singapore, we could sleep at night.
We thought Singapore itself was a very strong base. It had big guns, it had naval guns, it had everything. And we thought all the British troops that were there, we thought nobody would ever take this place.
Australia's fate was naive. Stretched on several fronts, the British could only release 2 warships to Singapore, the Prince of Wales and Repulse. But 8 days after arriving, both ships were sunk off the east coast of Malaya. The Australian population was shaken to the core, and the British Empire in the Pacific was brought to its knees. Only the Australian, British and Indian troops in Malaya could now save Singapore. In the face of a dramatic Japanese advance, the British and Indian troops crumbled. The Australians were sent in to confront the invasion.
Strange enough, I was the foremost man, and there's a whole army, Japanese army, coming down the road to me, and I'm there. Not really. I was asleep when they come through, and my mate, he had all the grenades, and I was a mortar man, and he goes like that, and he points, and 8 feet away, there's 50 Japanese on push bikes riding down the road towards Singapore, and behind them another 50, and another 50, and another 50.
The overconfident Japanese were caught in a cleverly planned ambush. The road became a killing field.
I fired for 10 minutes, I suppose. And then I saw 4 other Japanese in the cutter. So I went in with the bayonet. So I got one bloke through the back. The strange thing about that too, these 4 Japanese screaming like pigs, absolutely screaming. When one bloke's got me by the throttling me, on top of me, choking me. And the other bloke's leaning over with a bayonet and stabbing me.
Ray Brown survived with 22 bayonet wounds. The ambush was a resounding success. The wounded were evacuated and only 1 Australian was killed. It led to unjustified optimism as the next Australian battalions moved north.
It sounds ridiculous now, but I can remember blokes cheering as we went up in the wagons. And the next thing we know is all hell lets loose. There's machine guns firing and there's bombs coming over and there's snipers in the trees and everything else. And we suddenly thought, gee, we're in it. I reckon I dug the deepest slit trench in Malaya. I thought I could have gone through to England.
The Australians withstood the Japanese barrage and countered by destroying 10 tanks. But heavily outnumbered, they were soon surrounded. Malaya became a series of gallant stands, ending in fighting withdrawal.
We ran into our own artillery who were covering our retreat, and fellows got killed by our own artillery. And so the next move was into the swamps.
Wounded Australians were slaughtered by the Japanese. The frightened survivors reached Singapore and waited for the final assault.
And once they'd landed, well, they just kept coming. And there was no stopping them. And it went on for days. I think for 8 days, we virtually didn't sleep for 8 days. There was no sleep. Well, you couldn't sleep. On the Sunday night, there was suddenly quiet silence. We didn't know what had happened. And then somebody came around and said, it's all over. All I can remember is laying down, and I woke up the next morning. And when we woke up, we thought, well, this is the finish. We'll be all, they'll kill a lot of us.
We were absolutely horrified. Most of the men just broke their rifles and lay down and cried, you know. And they just want to fight. I mean, I suppose it's, well, we were taught to fight. You know? That's all it was about. We knew we could beat them. Well, we thought we could.
The surrender was a black day. The imperial insurance policy had failed, and Australians felt betrayed. 15,000 Australians fell into Japanese hands and were marched into Changi prison camp. All the time, the Japanese moved closer to Australia. Our troops in Rabaul, Ambon and Timor fought valiantly, but were defeated. And on the 28th of February 1942, HMAS Perth sailed into a Japanese invasion fleet off Java.
I was down in the lowest steering position. My job was chief quartermaster and I was steering the ship. And just through the bulkhead was where this torpedo hit, in the magazine. And I heard the captain say, "That's torn it." And then from then on, we were just consistently being blown to pieces. We were in tropics and blokes were in white gear. And when I got into the sick bay flat, which is just outside the sick bay, there were a lot of bodies there, all in white, but all well and truly bloodstained, so that what you got was a picture of red and white. On occasions, they decorate the quarter deck with signal flags. And when I looked at these blokes, the thought occurred to me, it's the last of the celebration, you know, there they are. Just like after the dance, we pull down the flags.
"353 men were lost. In the blackness of this terrible night, as the survivors struggled for air, the future for Australia seemed grim indeed.
And then a couple of Japanese destroyers came in and they'd stopped their engines and drifted amongst us. And there were these chaps on board, all in beautiful white suits, you know, and here were we in the water looking up, you know, like mendicants, beggars and so forth. We had one bloke and he screamed out, "Help, help, save me," and all the rest of it. And they said, "Shut up, you bastard," you know. And then a clear voice came from the bridge of this destroyer. And he said, "Ah, we good boys now, eh, Aussie?" Just like that.